Was there a first human being called Adam? Because there are a number of different views in the church today, sadly, upon this. Many people are now beginning to advocate that there was never a first man called Adam. One of the proponents behind that is a man called Dr. Dennis Lamoureux. Another view of Adam is by a famous scientist here in the UK by the name of Dr. Dennis Alexander, who argues that Adam was probably a Neolithic farmer. Then another Old Testament scholar, C. John Collins, believes if you're going to interpret Adam according to Genesis and according to science, then you need to see Adam as the head of a tribe. And then there are many other interpretations. For example, John Walton, probably the most famous Old Testament scholar and influential in many circles today, believes Adam was an archetype of all humanity. And he basically addresses Genesis according to ancient Near Eastern literature. But we're not going to get into those things tonight. We're going to ask the question, what's the biblical evidence for the first man named Adam? And then what there is in science to back that up. So Nathaniel, let's start by looking at some of the biblical evidence for one man named Adam and some of the key passages that we need to think about. Can you tell us some of those things beginning in Genesis maybe?
I'm going to jump to the gospel itself because I can't think of anything more important to believers watching than that foundational truth of Christianity. And Romans 5 makes it very clear that the whole logic of the gospel is grounded in the existence of a literal historical first man from whom all of us alive today descend. One man sins, one man saves. And I remember talking with a pastor that I had, well, at the church I grew up in. He came on staff after I moved away to go off to school. And I was wrestling with this idea of inherited sin, original sin, and us, in a sense, bearing the consequences of Adam's choice. And I thought, well, I'm sure a lot of people have thought this, that's not fair. How can I wrestle with that theological truth? And his answer to me was, in a sense, to flip it back around to Christ and say, well, it's not fair either for Christ to bear the sins of all mankind. So if you're okay with Jesus, you should accept Adam. If you want to do away with Adam and that concept of inherited sin and depravity, then you need to take it to its logical conclusion. And I softened very quickly on my feelings of unfairness towards inheriting sin from Adam, because I have no interest in doing away with Jesus as the savior for my sins, despite how unfair that was to him, his act of grace and mercy on our behalf, taking our punishment. So there's the fundamental message of Christianity. Jesus has come as a man, as the God-man, died in our place, taken the punishment, God's wrath on our behalf, so that all who believe in him can be saved. And he's our substitute. And Paul says it's parallel then to how we all became sinners. So as one man died, sin entered the world. Through one man, sin entered the world, and death through sin, Romans 5:12. So that's the basic concept of Christianity. One man, Jesus, the God-man, can save us, just as one man, Adam, not the God-man, just the first man, sinned, and we all became sinners. So those who want to do away with an original Adam, he's just a metaphor. He's just one of a population of people. And I highlight the latter because those are what my genetics colleagues are often saying. What are you going to do with Romans 5? And if you look at the major theistic evolutionary websites, and I'm familiar with the one on this side of the pond, BioLogos, founded by the current U.S. National Institutes of Health leader Francis Collins, their view is, again, a variety of views on Adam, and they recognize we've got a problem when it comes to Romans 5. And so what do? They begin to reinterpret Romans 5. Now, what does that tell you about the damage it does to the gospel? Big deal here, big consequences, huge implications. There's the bottom line when it comes to Adam. The Bible teaches a literal Adam, and it ties him and his actions directly to Jesus and his actions. And it couldn't be more explicit, the tie between the two. And even those who oppose a literal Adam recognize this connection and recognize they've got a lot of work to do to deal with Romans 5. And sadly, the direction that they're going is to reinterpret Romans 5. And if you start doing Romans 5, you're pretty much messing with the fundamental message of Christianity and going and leaving orthodoxy rather quickly.
Yeah, and of course, Paul also picks up that point in 1 Corinthians 15 even verse 45, where he talks about the first man, Adam, became a living being, and then the last man, Adam. So he contrasts again the first man with the last Adam. And so if you do away with the first man, then if you're going to be logical, then you have to do away with the last man, Jesus Christ. And obviously, as you just said, you mess with the gospel message. But it's quite obvious that when you look at Genesis 2, Adam is uniquely created by the hand of God. There are no other people before him. I know many people are trying to argue today, well, there's Adam there and there are other people around, but that's not what we find in Genesis.
No, not at all. It's very clear from the plain reading of it. Genesis chapter 1, he makes one man, one woman. Genesis chapter 2, their relationship is a picture of Christ and the church. It's not multiple Adams and multiple Eves and polygamous animal-like relationships or who knows what. This is the fountainhead of the human race, two people. Adam names his wife Eve, Genesis 3, because she's the mother of all living, not some of the living, and only those we can, in future years, with much academic nuance, describe as some of the subset of a larger population, and who knows what else you want to add to that there. That's not what the text is teaching. It's explicit. The plain reading of it is just that. And I think the theistic evolutionists are fairly consistent in a sense, in the sense that they tend to take the approach that Genesis 1 through 11 is all metaphorical, which if you're going to start trying to reinterpret one man, multiple women, why not go that direction? If you're going to do away with the plain reading of the text on Adam and Eve, why not do it the plain reading of Genesis 1 through 11? I'm not endorsing that. I think it's completely wrong and contrary to what the text is actually saying, but at least they're consistent in those first 11 chapters of being metaphorical all the way. So those chapters make it clear. Those are all the people. People, of course, like to raise the issue, and the logic I see from many of my opponents, biblical opponents on this issue is, if I can find a way in which you're wrong, or if I can find a question in your interpretation, therefore I must be right. So a favorite, of course, is, where did Cain get his wife? See, there must have been more people alive. That, of course, doesn't justify the view that there were a whole population of proto-humans hanging around before Adam. But again, the logic is, you're wrong, therefore I must be right. And so one of the ways they try to say the young earth view must be wrong is, well, you can't explain Cain's wife. Well, of course we can. If they pay attention to the literature, it's very clear that there's a long-standing explanation that makes perfect scientific and biblical sense. Cain married his sister. We think that's disgusting today, and the Bible explicitly forbids it later in redemptive history, not at this early point in redemptive history. And there's a, well, that you just have to look at what the Bible says and the timing of when God gives that command. And scientifically, it's easily explained when you consider the fact that God created, and you think about genetics from a biblical perspective. You think about the fact that God created Adam and Eve perfect. There was no sin. There was no corruption in their bodies, no corruption in their DNA. One of the biological reasons why it's highly discouraged to marry a close relative today is the fact that we have so many mutations, mistakes, so much corruption in our DNA today. We mask a lot of that by marrying people who we don't think are close relatives. So the chance that my wife and I both have the exact same DNA mistakes is low. So even though I may pass on a whole bunch of mistakes to my children, there's a chance my wife's DNA, her version at those specific DNA positions, is still preserved and close to what Adam and Eve's was, and vice versa. So she passes on some mistakes. There's a chance that my DNA still has good versions of that. And so these good versions mask these bad versions. Well, it's really a probability argument. If you marry a sister today, there's a high probability, because you're both getting your DNA from the same two people, your parents. You both have inherited a whole subset of DNA mistakes. And so there's a high probability you will both pass on, each of you, a bad version and a bad version. And so what used to be masked, and it is typically masked when people who are not close relatives marry, now gets unmasked, and either they're infertile in some cases, they can't even bring a baby to term because the baby is deformed or somehow unable to survive because of these mutations, or you get lots of deformity. So all that to say, it's very easy to explain where Cain got his wife. There's nothing icky about it when you consider the biology, a very straightforward, common sense, in a sense, explanation. I should say, maybe it's not common sense, but it doesn't involve any hocus pocus. It's very straightforward genetics, one that makes sense in light of the other parameters of Scripture. I've read another person too trying to say, well, see, look, you all talk about Nephilim, one of the most debated topics in even young earth circles. Who are the people of Genesis chapter 6? I thought that was a real stretch. Of course, this is coming from a guy who's basically a professional troll and can't be bothered to hardly cite a single academic young earth work on any of the stuff he's writing on. But that's just another illustration of if I can poke a hole in what you're saying, therefore I must be right. If you're wrong, therefore I must be right. None of these amount to much of anything. They're pretty lazy and poorly articulated attempts to undermine the young earth view, and there are no good objections to the young earth view. I would say honest scholars would recognize, yeah, young earth is basically the plain reading of the text, but we don't want to go there because of science or because of something else. And all the arguments I've heard biblically against the straightforward reading, to me, amount to little more than, well, we don't have to take it that way, do we? Or it's just sloppiness. What do you do with this? Well, we've done that, namely in the case of Cain's wife, and answered that a long time ago. Where have you been? There's long-standing answers to these questions that make sense, and you really don't have much of a rebuttal to it. I don't see much from my opponents in the way of, now I see that you talked about Cain's wife and you talked about perfect genomes, and I found another problem with your idea of perfect genomes. They don't even go there. They're not even aware that we've come up with this explanation or identified a very plausible explanation. It's just, well, what do you do with Cain's wife? As if we've never thought about this question before. Yeah. And that sadly is, to me, an all too common pattern in those who want to deny the literal existence, or I should say, to deny the existence of a literal Adam and Eve just a few thousand years ago.
Yeah. And so, of course, all those questions that you just brought up are answered on our website. So if people who are watching want to dig in deeper to that, then just go to answersingenesis.org and just type your question into the search engine. If you've got any questions for us tonight, by the way, just type them into the comment section and we'll try and get to those. But before we get on to the other questions that I had in mind for you, I did think of one thing that wasn't on the list of questions I sent you, was the ages of people in the genealogies in Genesis 5, because one of the things theistic evolutionists like to throw up as well, people could have never lived that long. It would have been impossible, because we read of Adam living 930 years, and then you read of the other people in the genealogies, and they all live for hundreds of years until, you get halfway through or to the end of Genesis, then it sort of drops off. So is there any genetic reason for that, or was it to do with environment or something else, that the reason people live that long?
This is a good point to bring up, and in its form, this objection, this argument is very similar to the one with Cain's wife. It's another, see, I found a problem in what you're saying, therefore I must be right. That's one parallel. The second parallel is, see, this is the way the world operates today, therefore the world must have always operated this way. See, today we can't marry close relatives, therefore we couldn't have ever married close relatives. No, there's an arrow of time and an arrow of decay laid down in Genesis chapter 3. Romans 8 echoes this. The world is groaning. Things are not today like they always have been. They were created perfect and they've been degenerating ever since. And so if you start with those premises, as the plain reading of Scripture says, and if you try to take young earth creationism on its own terms and see if you can find a flaw, you don't find one. So this is another example of that. We don't see people living long today. It doesn't seem possible to live that long. It's a multi-million-dollar question of research. People are trying to find ways to live longer. I can attest to this personally. That was being researched when I was in graduate school. I was working in the medical field, working on cancer questions, stem cell questions. There were colleagues of mine, fellow students, who were working on questions of aging. It was a hot topic. Still is a hot topic. Well, let's take young earth creationism on its own terms. Once again, we have God creating perfect pair in the beginning, then they sin and corruption begins. Their sinfulness grows so wicked, the whole world goes so corrupt, God destroys everyone except 8 people. This is effectively a genetic bottleneck. And then after the flood is when you see these genomes, or these lifespans, I should say, decaying. And someone has plotted out the ages before the flood and then the ages after the flood. And they've pointed out this seems to bear a strong resemblance to a genetic decay curve. We don't yet have a solid answer in terms of being able to delineate this is exactly the explanation. We've got a number of good candidate hypotheses: environmental changes, genetic degradation, lots of accumulation of mutations, my point is we don't yet have, we haven't been able to say it's this, not this, or it's all of these and this percentage. We don't know all the contributing factors and their specific individual roles in the in the question of why lifespans decayed. But to say that they're short today and therefore they must have always been short is to ignore the fact and the arrow of time that says no, things today are very different from what they were back then. And you even have Psalms. I think it's a Psalm that talks about now man's lifespan will be such. I think it's the Psalm, one of the Psalms of Moses, Psalm 90, where he talks about people tend to live 80 or so years. But this is long after the flood, long after the beginning. And there's no reason within a young earth framework why it's not possible to have long-lived people, especially before the flood, just a few generations, and I would argue probably just a few mutations removed from the very good, perfect state in which Adam and Eve were created. So I see no biblical reason to question this. I see hardly any scientific reason to do the same. And so that objection to me is, again, one that's been addressed in the literature previously, and one I've not seen my opponents try to take to the next level. Well, what do you do with the patriarchs? Well, have you read anything we've written on this? Probably not. So you don't see them saying, I've read, you talked about genetic decay curves or these sorts of things, and I've got another objection to that. No, you don't really see that. Nothing that's cogent or in any way a valid objection to this. So I see little merit to that argument against the young earth view and the age and the existence of a literal Adam and Eve as delineated in Scripture.
Yeah, and of course there's an interesting passage in, I think it's Genesis 47, which shows the consistency of the ages and the interpretation of Genesis. Because when Joseph takes his father Jacob to meet Pharaoh, basically summarizing this, Pharaoh says to Jacob, "Wow, you look really old," because Jacob was about 140 years old at that time, and he says, "If you think I'm old, you should see my father's." And so the text is consistent with itself. You see people dropping off and not living as long, but there were still, for our day, living a long time. Let's ask the question: since Adam and Eve were the first human people, what would their DNA have looked like?
Yes, at this point, if you're okay with it, I want to jump to the presentation where I answer it sort of by first addressing what have people said against it. And then circle back around to this question of what did it look like. We've already covered a little bit of this in saying that it was perfectly created. There were no flaws in it, no mutations, no mistakes. These would come later due to God's cursing of the creation. But that hasn't stopped many theistic evolutionists, secular evolutionists, and others from arguing against the literal existence of Adam and Eve. They would say that, of course, Adam and Eve genetically do not exist. And actually, I want to cover two questions briefly. The one I just mentioned, how many people did we come from? Because this is one that's received tremendous time and attention in the last several years, with prominent voices arguing that genetics forbids the existence of two people. Genetics says we never were a population of just two people, therefore we have to rethink the Bible. That's sort of how the logic goes. What's fallen by the wayside from a genetic perspective is the question of how long ago our ancestors lived, and we're going to discuss the reasons why later. But first I want to deal with one that's received the most popular attention and the most communication lately, and then we'll talk about why this second question has fallen by the wayside, what the answers are. And a little hint is, I think, because the answers are inconvenient for the mainstream paradigm, but very friendly to the young earth one. So it's worth making that point again. But first, this one. I want to start by contrasting in broad brushstrokes the differences between the teaching of Scripture and what mainstream folks are saying. And so even theistic evolutionists are simply adopting mainstream science in their views of the past and then reinterpreting the Bible to mold it. So this might be a little small here on the screens of our viewers, but I want to highlight here on the left, we've got Adam and Eve as the first pair. And basically, with a brief interruption of the flood, maybe 10 or so generations after Adam and Eve, human population growth has just been steadily increasing from those two people ever since. And of course, it's exploded in the last few hundred years into the nearly 8 billion people alive today. So it's got this, in a sense, hockey stick shape where it's fairly flat. In the last few hundred years, it shoots up. That's human population growth from a biblical perspective. Starts with 2 and then steadily grows, with punctuated by brief downturns like the Black Death in Europe and so forth in history. But generally, if you look at archaeology and historical records, that's the pattern. Evolution gives something very different. And I'm going to put these side by side, even though their timescales are very different. We're going to address that separately in a few minutes. Evolutionists do not have a hockey stick shape for human population growth. It's a little bit more of an hourglass with a spread here at the bottom. They say about 6 million years ago, there was a population of ape-like creatures. And at that time, the lineage that led to chimpanzees and the lineage that would lead to humans split, went their separate ways. So this is now the human lineage. It, for a while, shrank and stayed around a few thousand people in the past, going through these various ancestral ape men forms. 6,000 here, 12,000 here. At some point in the fairly recent past, so to speak, evolutionarily, within the last several tens of thousands of years, maybe 30,000 years ago, we underwent a severe bottleneck by evolutionary standards, shrinking to a population of maybe 2,000, and then population resumed growth again to the nearly 8 billion people we see today. So evolutionists would say, yes, there was a bottleneck in our past, but it was never just 2 people. We've shrunk as a population. Our ancestors have ebbed and flowed, and at some point there was a severe constriction, never 2 people. Orders of magnitude higher than that. Therefore, since there was never any 2 people, we must have never had a Adam and Eve in our ancestry. Now these diagrams, if you like them, come from Answers Magazine. I worked with the designers on this. One of the issues in which we addressed this is about a year ago, but you can find it on you can subscribe to this, get back issues. I'd encourage all our viewers to sign up for Answers Magazine, bi-monthly magazine, keeping up to speed on the latest in science and scripture as it relates to the Genesis issues, origins issues. But why do evolutionists say this is how the history of our population growth looked? Why do they say hourglass, not hockey stick shape? What I want to do in the next few minutes is dive into the weeds of population genetics. And it can be very complex. We're not going to make it complex. We're going to keep it very simple. We want to dive into the weeds, hack away at them so that the complexity is simplified, and then come up for air. And there's really one major point I want you to see. So even if what I say in the next few minutes gets a little complex, I want to say to our viewers here, stick with me, because my main goal here is not that you walk away with 10 points about population genetics. My main point in the next few minutes is to give you a very clear feeling that will reveal to you the key to this whole debate. So anyone can follow this. Anyone can recognize the problems with the way evolutionists argue against Adam and Eve. I want to get there by helping you reach a specific feeling about this. So since we're talking about DNA, I'm going to represent individual people by DNA strand. So this rectangle with a DNA strand in it, I'm going to say is one person. And I'm going to use colors to represent a unique combination of DNA letters that is each unique individual person. So this is one person with their unique DNA. These are 3 unique individuals with unique DNA combinations. And this would represent then, this next slide here would represent a whole group, a whole population of unique individuals, each with unique DNA combinations. Now, genetics is the field of science to which theistic evolutionists, mainstream evolutionists turn to make conclusions about the size of the population from whom we came. Now that sentence is far from being anywhere intuitive to anyone listening, I'm sure. Why would genetics, the field of genetics, how could DNA tell us how many people we came from? We're much more accustomed to thinking about DNA when we think about who do we come from. Maybe you've taken a DNA test, done some of these standard genetic tests, spit into a tube, give them $100, they'll come back and tell you, okay, you're 60% Irish, 80% Scottish, 10% German, one of these sorts of things. That's a question of who do we come from? Why would anyone use genetics to tell us how many we came from? It really boils down to, in its most frequent manifestation, to a question of how many DNA differences there are. And there are certain patterns of DNA differences that reflect certain patterns in the numbers of our ancestors. So let's walk through a couple of scenarios to try to derive why there is a connection between the field of genetics and DNA and this question of how many people were in our family tree in the past. So let's say this set of 3 people represents a small population of individuals. In an ideal world, a generation would pass, all 3 of them would reproduce, there'd be no change. The next generation, again, this is an idealized, mathematically perfect world where no perturbations happen. That's, of course, not the real world. There are people who never marry, never have offspring. There are some people who marry but are infertile. There are some people who marry and have lots of kids. So these sorts of differences that occur every generation because of how the human experience works leads to consequences in DNA variety. Let's say in this generation, in this coming generation now, the individual in the purplish blue on the left failed to reproduce. Maybe they never marry, but the person in the middle, the red person, has multiple children. Well, in the next generation, you'd see the unique purple DNA combination disappear. We'd lose that DNA variety, whereas the red would begin to dominate. Now you go to the next generation, red is now the majority. Let's say we have another idealized, mathematically idealized set of generations where each of the 2 red individuals reproduces once and the green individual reproduces once. Again, though, this is not how the real world works. Over time, statistically, the red individual is likely to eventually dominate and overtake the green individual. There's just more of the red individual around. So at some point, the green DNA variety might also be lost. And the point that I'm trying to show here is when you have small populations, it's fairly easy to lose DNA variety. And so if there have been just a few people in the past, we should see very little DNA variety today because DNA variety gets lost easily just due to chance, we'd say, in small populations. That's a basic principle of population genetics. Because humans are not perfect mathematical equations. Some marry, some don't. Some have children, some don't. Some have lots of kids, some have few kids. These sorts of changes accumulate over time. That's one scenario. I'm going to show you the opposite scenario where there's a lot of individuals. Again, let's say this is a perfectly ideal mathematical world. A generation passes and everyone reproduces as they should. No changes occur. That's not the real world. Changes occur. Some people reproduce, some people don't. So the next generation, you might lose that purple individual. And then you reproduce, and then the next generation might lose another individual, and so on and so forth. I'm going to go through all of these slides here, and it's going to make you weary. It makes me weary to go through all these slides to see how many generations it takes for the red individual, just by chance, to overtake and become the dominant DNA variety in this population. It requires red continually reproducing lots and lots over time. And it may just do this by chance. Other people don't marry and have kids. The point is, and you'll begin to feel this as these slides keep going on and on and on, it takes a long time for one particular combination of DNA to overtake a whole population if there's a lot of people at the start. It just takes that much longer. And so if you have a set of people today and you've got a certain time period in which they've had ancestors, if they've got a lot of DNA variety today, you'd say they must have had a lot of ancestors. If they've got a little bit of DNA variety today, you must have said that they must have come from a small population. And the principle is it takes a long time to lose DNA variety in a large population. It can happen fairly quickly in a small population. It's basically a statistics and probability argument. That's the essence of population genetics. I never even took a course in population genetics as a trained biologist, a PhD biologist. And I'd say many biologists try to avoid it because it's essentially the application of math to genetics. And who wants to do that? Some people do. And it's a needed discipline and a vital discipline in today's world. And it's the central discipline to the arguments from theistic evolutionists and others against the existence of a literal Adam and Eve. I'll tell you how they make that argument in a moment. We're still not going through this long-winded derivation of why large populations take a long time, but hopefully you can see this. There's just so many steps it takes to there. Finally, we've gotten rid of all the varieties. That's the first principle that I want us to feel and see. DNA variety is lost more easily in small populations. So if today you got a sample of DNA variety from people around the globe and it looked like this, fairly homogeneous, you'd say, oh, I guess the evolutionists would say, oh, I guess we came from a small population. We don't have that much DNA variety. Whereas if the human population looked like this today, lots of DNA variety, a population geneticist would say, oh, it looks like we came from a lot of people. And since we look fairly homogeneous today, the evolutionists agree in a sense and say we came from a small population. What they deny, of course, is coming from just two. We'll get to that more in a moment. That's not the only principle that's at play, and that confounds this analysis of population genetics. There's a second principle. Let's say you start with this population, lots of DNA variety, lots of people, but then a catastrophe occurs. Maybe there's a plague, maybe coronavirus wipes out a whole bunch of people. Maybe it's the Black Death, maybe it's the flu of 1918. Name something from history where a bunch of people get wiped out. What happens is you lose a bunch of folks and their DNA combinations. And so when that population recovers, there's not going to be nearly the DNA variety today that there was at the beginning, because there's been a severe population collapse, a severe population drop off. And when those happen, you lose a lot of DNA variety. You might expect then in the opposite scenario, the opposite conclusion to be reached. So let's say you start like this, just like we did in that other scenario, but instead of having a population contraction, there's population growth. And just to be able to display it on one screen, I've got to draw these individual people smaller. So if the population is growing rapidly, everyone's reproducing, it begins to look like this over time. You don't lose anything or hardly anything. That's the second principle then of population genetics. First is that you lose DNA variety fairly easily and quickly in a small population. You don't do it so quickly in a large population. You lose it also when the population shrinks, of course, because you just kill off a bunch of people and their DNA with them. You don't lose that when the population grows. Now you might say, well, why even bring this up? A shrinking population is basically the same as a starting small population. Yes, but let's give an evolutionary example. This is, by analogy, a look at how the Native American population looks today. They're fairly homogeneous, and I'm saying relative to, let's say, Europeans, who look less homogeneous. Evolutionists say that even though both Native Americans and Europeans came from the same ancestral population, 50,000, 100,000 years ago, they look different today. Why? Because Native Americans in the recent few hundred years have undergone a massive population crash after the arrival of Columbus in the New World with new diseases and so forth, whereas Europeans in the same time frame did not, hence the difference. So there's nuances to all this, and population geneticists will invoke different principles at different points in history. You might think this is getting confusing. Yes, and hopefully you're beginning to feel what I'm hoping you'll feel in a few minutes, and then the light bulb will click on, you'll say, aha, this is what's going on. There's yet another principle that's at play here. And what I want to show you in this case is the duration of population collapse or population growth also makes a difference. So let's say this is your starting population, fairly homogeneous. And then you shrink, you lose DNA variety, look like this. I just got ahead of myself. Okay. I got ahead of myself. I need to back up here and make a different point, but that's okay because it'll still accomplish the same goal that I want to. Let's say your starting population looks like this, fairly homogeneous. It won't take very long, even if you're a large population, to become even more homogeneous because you have very little DNA variety at the start. But if you start like this, it's going to take a long time to lose all these DNA varieties. Let me make that point even better because I was getting ahead of myself here and I don't want to mess this up. Let's say you start like this, and then you shrink, and then you regrow. Because you started with very little, you're going to end up even more homogeneous at the end. If you start like this, and then you shrink, and then you regrow, and it's just a small shrinkage and regrowing, you're going to look like this. You're still going to be fairly heterogeneous. So this third principle is that equations and your population genetic inferences about how many people we came from and how few people we came from, that changes depending on how much DNA variety was there at the start. One last principle, and if you're like, you're losing me, that's part of the point. I'm not hoping we all come away as expert population genetics here. We're deep in the weeds. I want you to come away with a very specific feeling. What if you start like this? You're fairly homogeneous, but you're still a large population, and you shrink, but it's maybe one generation of shrinkage. You might end up looking like that. Virtually nothing changes. What if you start like this, fairly homogeneous, but you shrink and you stay a small population for thousands of generations, as evolutionists like to say in our past? You might end up looking like this. So the fourth principle at play is, how long does a shrinkage or growth period happen? Now, you might say, you've lost me. That was way too much detail. That's the point. There are so many principles you can invoke to explain the DNA variety that we see today, it becomes very difficult to use it as an apologetic argument. Watch what I'm saying now. So I've just listed a few of them. Population genetics is a complex field, lots of math. If you say, okay, there's this much DNA variety in the population today, is it because there was a small starting population? Is it because there was a collapse in the population in the past? Does it have something to do with how much DNA variety was at the start? Was there a contraction that was of long duration? How do you know which one of these principles to invoke? Well, the evolutionists say, we've got the answer. You start with a fairly large starting population and very little DNA variety. You shrink it for a long period of time, and you can explain the data. That's their answer. What we see today fits this model. Here's their mistake. They say because it fits evolution, therefore creation is wrong. Hold on. There's 4 different principles I've just given with a bunch of different parameters, and there's even more you could invoke. What if we start with a tiny starting population that has, and God endows these 2 people, Adam and Eve, with lots of DNA variety from the start. Their descendants undergo rapid population growth, basically for most of human history. When there are, fly in my house, sorry. When there are collapses in the population, they're fairly quick, and then there's regrowth as the rule. Well, guess what? This also explains the DNA data that we see. Here's my basic point. Not that everyone would now become expert population genetics. My point is that people would feel just how complex it is to make a population inference from DNA data. You look at a particular, all you have really today is, this is how different Simon and I are. This is how different Europeans are from Asians. This is how different Asians are from Africans. And then you say, okay, what factors can we invoke in the past to explain this? Well, there's a whole bunch of different ways you can explain it. Evolution is one of them. And the mistake that my opponents make in trying to argue against the young earth model is that just because their set of 4, 15, 20 parameters explains the data, somehow that must mean my set of parameters is wrong. It's not. The bottom line is to use genetics as a way to argue against a literal Adam and Eve is a really tough argument to advance. That's the bottom line in all of this. You don't have to be an expert in population genetics. All you have to know is there's a whole bunch of different factors you can invoke. Evolution has a set of factors and it works. Well, guess what? Creation has a set of factors and it works too. And there's probably a whole bunch of other ways you can explain it as well. It's not a good argument against Adam and Eve, yet they go around saying this is the argument against creation. I think part of the reason they get away with it is because they phrase it in such complex language. Nobody can follow it. It just sounds authoritative. But when you dig down into the details, you find there's a whole lot of ways you can explain what we see today. Evolution fits it, creation fits it, and we're no further along in the debate. Their argument against creation falls apart. That's my bottom line for this first question. How many people do we come from? My point again was not that you can walk away and recite to people the multiple factors, multiple parameters, multiple things to consider when trying to make an inference from genetic data using population genetics. My basic point is this field of science, this sub-discipline of genetics to which evolutionists turn to try to argue against Adam and Eve is far too nuanced and has far too many explanations that can be invoked to constitute a legitimate argument against Adam and Eve. It does not work. Both of these views fit it. And the bottom line for me is this is not a great field of science in which to try to compare these two. It's a little bit like saying, well, the sky is blue, creation is wrong. Say what? Both of these ideas explain the blueness of the sky. What does that have to do with the debate? This is really just a more complex version of that type of argument. We see a little bit of variety today among people. We're all about 99.9% identical. Yep, creation explains that. Oh, well, I thought evolution was the only explanation. Nope, there's a whole lot of explanations that can explain the same data. So let's move on to the next question. That's what I want to do now, because this question, did we come from 2 people? Yeah, it fits the genetic data quite well. Fits evolution, fits probably 1,000 different things. Not a great field of science in which to try to argue against Adam and Eve. Here's a better question that we can answer, and that I think evolutionists would not like to discuss because the evidences are not in their favor. How long ago did our first ancestors live? And I'm going to say Adam and Eve. Evolutionists might say somebody else. There's a point at which, though, they would say modern humans, modern Homo sapiens began, and that's about 200,000, 300,000 years ago. That's their time point. I'd say we began 6,000 years ago. So I'm going to go back to this diagram that I showed earlier, but now I'm going to try to draw it a little bit more to scale in terms of time scales, where this is 6,000 years ago, this is 30,000, 200,000 years ago. That's not a fair comparison. It's more like this, where there's, and this isn't even to scale either, because there's orders of magnitude different between a few thousand years and hundreds of thousands of years. But that's the basic point. We'd say we go back just a few hundred generations. They go back thousands, tens of thousands of generations. Now, how can we answer this with genetics? This is, again, a question where you might not naturally say, yeah, I'm going to use genetics to answer this question. How long ago did our ancestors live? We typically think of genetics as who did we come from, not when did we come from these people. Well, I'm not going to use the DNA that we just discussed. Population genetics focuses heavily on DNA that's inherited from both parents. And there's a whole lot of factors that go into it. Doesn't make for a good subfield of genetics by which to answer the question of how long ago do the ancestors live. There's a technical reason for that. I'm not going to go into it for sake of time and to keep the discussion simple. There are two subsets of our DNA that lend themselves to answering the question of when. When did our first ancestors live? And that's DNA that's inherited through mom only, and DNA that's inherited through dad only. The stuff through mom is called mitochondrial DNA. It's just a tiny fraction of our DNA, less than 1%. There's a cell biology basis for how it comes about being inherited. You can look it up. I'm not going to go into it just for sake of time. My point is, this is inherited from mom, and it's inherited in our fallen, sinful, cursed world imperfectly. Over time, as mothers pass it on to daughters, they pass it on to sons as well, but I don't pass it on. My wife passes on her mitochondrial DNA, so that lineage stops with me. Mistakes occur. We live in a fallen world. DNA isn't copied perfectly, and these accumulate over time, and so it acts like a clock. Every time a new mistake is added, it's another tick of the clock. And so then today you can say, how different are Simon and I in our mitochondrial DNA? How different am I from Ken Ham? How different am I from the British Prime Minister? And we can count the number of differences between us, among us. And if there are few differences, few ticks of the clock, we must have a recent common ancestor. If there are many differences between us, many ticks of the clock, you have to go back in the distant past into deep time to find that common ancestor. So that's the principle behind mitochondrial DNA. It gets more nuanced and complex if you use DNA that's inherited from both parents. So the question is, when did our first maternal ancestor live? Given the number of differences that we see today, and we've got people from around the globe, we've got British people, we've got Americans, we've got Africans, Asians, Native Americans, we've got a good sample of the globe. We know approximately how many ticks of the clock separate us as people groups around the globe. What we need then is some way to measure how fast the clock is ticking today. Get mothers, daughters, grandmothers, granddaughters, count the number of differences between them. That tells you how fast or slow the clock ticks every generation. Does a mistake occur every generation, every couple generations? Does it take hundreds of generations before the clock ticks? That's what nobody knows until you measure it. Well, the first time it was measured was in a subset of our mitochondrial DNA. It was reported in Nature Genetics and commented on in Science magazine, both mainstream sources, both places where evolutionists publish, and evolution is the rule. And they said, this is Ann Gibbons commenting on that first discovery. She said, researchers calculated that mitochondrial Eve, that first ancestor, that she lived, the woman whose mitochondrial DNA was ancestral to all that living people, to that and all living people. They've calculated prior to this study that she lived 200,000, 100,000 to 200,000 years ago in Africa. That's background. Now here's the key sentence. Commenting on this new discovery in 1997, she's commenting on early 1998. Using the new mitochondrial DNA clock, where we actually measured mothers, daughters, grandmothers, granddaughters, that lady, mitochondrial Eve, would be a mere 6,000 years old. This is not creationist writing, this is mainstream science. No one thinks that's the case, of course. Well, if you look at the primary data, that of course sparked a whole several years of controversy, a couple decades of controversy. If you look at the results that have come out since that initial publication, they're consistent. I've published on this myself, taking the raw data from the evolutionary literature, and what you find is that initial conclusion is unchanged. Based on the mitochondrial DNA clock, when did our first maternal ancestor live? 6,000 years ago. Fits what the Bible says. No wonder people aren't talking about this as much. So that's DNA that's inherited from mom. That's one side of the equation. You can do a similar sort of calculation for DNA that's inherited from dad. In this case, it's not that ladies and men both have this DNA. It's that only males have it, only males pass it on. It's the Y chromosome. Females are XX, males are XY. I've got my Y chromosome from my dad. My wife is XX. My 3 boys have their Y chromosome from me. This represents about 1% of our DNA. So it's still a small fraction, not as small as mitochondrial DNA, but the same principle is at play. We live in a fallen, sinful, cursed world. The Y chromosome is not copied perfectly. Every so often, there are mistakes that occur. These are like ticks of the clock. And every time mistakes are added, another tick of the clock happens. So I can compare my Y chromosome to Simon's, to Ken Ham's, to the British Prime Minister, to Donald Trump, to anyone, and say, okay, how many differences separate us? If there's just a few differences, we must have a recent common ancestor. If there are many differences, many ticks of the clock have passed since we had a common ancestor. That common ancestor must have lived a long time ago. Once again, we've got Y chromosome sequences, Y chromosome DNA letters from people groups around the globe: Europeans, Native Americans, Africans, Asians, Papua New Guineans, so forth. So now that we know how many differences separate us, what we need is a measurement of fathers and sons, grandfathers and grandsons. You need to see how many differences exist, how many new differences arise from generation to generation. How fast does this Y chromosome clock tick? And this is stuff, if you look at the evolutionary literature, truth is stranger than fiction. This is stuff you can't make up. And in fact, I was taken down the evolutionary path myself initially. Not that I thought that evolution was true. It just, the initial Y chromosome results, I thought, oh, well, I guess the clock ticks slow. I'm not sure what the explanation is. The initial 2 studies that looked at fathers and sons showed that the clock ticked fairly slowly and fit the idea that we have a common male ancestor 200,000 years ago. Well, it turns out those initial 2 studies were based on low quality DNA. Subsequent studies in 2015 and 2017 were based on high quality DNA. And it turns out when you use high quality DNA, you find that the clock actually ticks very quickly in a manner that fits a Y chromosome Adam, more appropriately Y chromosome Noah, because that's our most recent male common ancestor scripturally. And for technical reasons, that's as far back as we can go with the current tools that we have. The clock ticks in a manner that's consistent with having that guy, Noah, live 4,500 years ago. Now, it took a little bit of work to discover this fact. In one of the papers that was based on high quality DNA, they looked at how fast the clock ticks in DNA that's inherited from both parents. So this particular study, published in Nature, 2017, looked at 150 Danish people, mother, father, offspring. So they looked at the DNA that's inherited from both parents. How fast does that DNA clock tick? They looked at DNA that's inherited from dad, but they looked at a different type of clock that's ticking. What was noticeably absent in their paper, whose sole purpose was looking at the rate at which DNA clocks tick, was some sort of comment about how fast or slow the Y chromosome clock ticks. And it turns out I was able to extract from the primary data the answer. And this is the answer, of course, was 4,500 years ago. So it was this glaring silence that spoke so loudly about what the answer is. Not only was the primary data consistent with this, but the fact that the evolutionists refused to comment on it, to me, told me, I bet you this is true, because why would you want to comment on something that disagrees with your paradigm? The other study says in the main text of the paper, this is from 2015, that we measured the differences between fathers and sons and it was consistent with our expectations. And I thought, oh, well, here's another paper that seems to be consistent with evolution. Well, it turns out if you dig in the supplemental information, where they talk about the details of how they arrived at their conclusion, they looked at the differences between fathers and sons, the rate at which the Y chromosome clock ticks, and the clock ticks in a manner consistent with 4,500 years ago. But that wasn't where the researchers stopped. They said, we know from these other low quality DNA studies, also from the timescale of evolution, that must be wrong. So they literally filtered out data that was contrary to their conclusions and kept filtering until the data and the results aligned with their preconceived notions. You can't make this stuff up. That's literally in the literature. These people aren't stupid. They're just so ingrained in one way of thinking about the world, they can't even let contrary data alter that position. They'll filter it out until conclusions, until the data match their conclusions. You can't make this up. So both the male inherited and the female inherited DNA fit what the biblical time scale is. For technical reasons, we can take mitochondrial DNA back to Eve, I think. For Y chromosome, only back to Noah. In both cases, the time scale fits. This is stuff I publish in our technical journal, Answers Research Journal. If you go to our website, Answers in Genesis. You can scroll down or just type in the search box, Answers Research Journal. It brings up our peer-reviewed technical journal. I've also been discussing some of this, if you've been following, in our ongoing series, A New History of the Human Race, some of the details from this. So, and there's more we could say about this for sake of time, though. That's the main conclusion we take from this. So just to summarize then, what does genetics tell us about Adam and Eve? There's a whole lot. And again, the New History of the Human Race series I've been doing with Ken Ham, you can find those on YouTube as well now. The previous episodes, it's ongoing, gets into much more detail on this. But the big picture is, when you try to infer how many people we came from, this is a very messy, nuanced field of science in which there's all sorts of explanations consistent with the data that we have today. So when evolutionists say it fits evolution, therefore you're wrong, they're making the mistake of not even trying to test creation, or not even recognizing that their own field of science fits all sorts of explanations. It's a bad field of science from which to make an argument Adam and Eve don't exist. It's really hard to do that. It fits Adam and Eve, it fits evolution, it fits all sorts of things. So let's move on to a question that actually does distinguish between creation and evolution, and that's the question of DNA clocks. And here the answer is a resounding confirmation of what the Bible says, and a very strong contradiction to what evolution says. And again, for even more details on this, you can see the New History of the Human Race series. That's, to me, what are the big takeaways when it comes to Adam and Eve. And I see very little basis for my evolutionary colleagues saying, you need to reject Adam and Eve, and you need to reinterpret the Bible. The plain reading of Scripture is just that. It's plain, it's evident. Even people who don't agree with the young earth position, Bible scholars will begrudgingly acknowledge that this is what this straightforward reading of the text says. But science, they say, forces us to reinterpret it. Hopefully what you've seen is science gives no such reason to reinterpret this. In fact, it confirms the plain reading of Scripture. And there's no reason anyone should start questioning, ultimately, the central truth of Christianity, the gospel, which is founded on one man sins, one man saves, because of what so-called science says in the modern era.
So we can actually be encouraged through the work that you and others are doing, looking at mitochondrial DNA and the clocks that are at work there, to see actually it supports what the Bible tells us all along. So we don't need to be afraid of anything coming from theistic evolutionists today. We need to actually get this information out to friends of ours who may hold that position and try and show them what's actually there in the data. But let me ask you another question, Nathaniel, because this often comes up, and I heard it from a really famous, probably the most famous apologist in the world recently, Dr. William Lane Craig, and he spoke on one of his podcasts of a conversation he had with someone you've debated, Dennis Venemer, and he said Dennis Venemer basically told him, he looked at him in the eyes and said, "You've got Neanderthal DNA in you," and basically Craig goes on to say how it shaped his thinking of Adam and Eve, because of course he rejects two people. Do we have Neanderthal DNA in us? And maybe first explain to people a biblical view of Neanderthals.
Yes, that's a good place to start. Everything we've seen so far in science indicates Neanderthals are fully human. They look different than us. There's a number of skeletal features that aren't very common in today's population. There is a difference that I happily acknowledge, but there is not a difference, I would say, that makes them anything like a separate species. To me, and based on the fossil layers they're found in, they are descendants of Noah and his family after the flood. Now, where the debate revolves around the dates, both from geology and then from using genetic clocks. So geologically, these Neanderthal fossils would be found in layers that they'd say are tens of thousands of years old, if not older. Mm-hmm. You can see what our geology colleagues have written on the shortcomings of mainstream geologic dating methods and why there's abundant reason to question them. And in fact, some of these radiometric dating methods, carbon-14 dating methods that they claim, mainstream scientists claim, point towards hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years old for the Earth and fossils and so forth. These actually are good arguments against that and support a young Earth view. I want to speak to the genetic side of the equation because that's more my field and is in the context then of what about Adam and Eve. in a sense, consistent with what we see at the skeletal level, anatomical level. If you look at their DNA sequence, they are outside the modern range of DNA variety. So you find the two most different living humans today, and when I mean different, I mean genetically different. The differences between those two people are still less than the differences between any Neanderthal DNA and any modern human DNA. So there's then the question of how do you explain that? Evolutionists explain all DNA differences by mutation. They say everything that exists in the world today is the result of a mistake, a chance process over time. They, before they even run their equations, start by ignoring the possibility that God could have created two people with DNA differences from the start. That's a huge omission. It's kind of like what you see in geology. They start the geologic work by first saying, we reject the existence of a global flood. Now let's look at the data. In this case, they say we reject the existence, the possibility of DNA differences arising from something other than mutation. So let's see how mutation explains it. That, of course, doesn't work. There's a logical problem with that. They reject young Earth creation by definition, not from the data. And I would say there's good evidence genetically pointing towards Adam and Eve, beginning with all sorts of variety from the start, and the vast majority of DNA differences today being the result of the creation process. Nonetheless, what do you do with the fact that there's so many differences between modern humans and Neanderthals at the genetic level? Evolutionists want to argue that it's another one of those, you must be wrong, therefore must be right, in a sense. They say, well, you can't cram all these DNA differences in 6,000 years. It's not possible. You're even more constrained by the fact that they're post-flood people. So you lose some generations, and it's not like you can say they were created with this, because they're not the first created people. They're the descendants of Adam and Eve. So you've got to explain it some other way. I've long been skeptical about whether or not the sequences that we call Neanderthal DNA are real. What I don't mean is that somehow people have invented this. They're extracting genetic material from Neanderthal fossils and running it through DNA sequencers and getting results. The question is, was that the original sequence in Neanderthals? Even within a young Earth view, these guys have been sitting on the ground for thousands of years, 4,000 years, exposed to the elements in some cases. They're not treated the way we treat DNA in the lab. When I think back to my undergraduate days, working with DNA from single-celled algae, working on photosynthesis, we would extract the DNA from these microscopic creatures and put it in special solutions and in the freezer to keep it from degrading, because DNA naturally, you leave it at room temperature in a tube in water, it'll degrade over time. It just happens. Even if we leave the DNA in the freezer in special conditions, after about a year, it tended to give weird results because it was degrading. And so we throw the DNA away and isolate some new stuff. If that's what happens in a year in the lab in conditions designed to preserve it, how much more degradation is going to happen in the field, in the ground, in fluctuating environments that are not designed to preserve this DNA in these fossils? Now, the mainstream community recognizes this. Their first step in analyzing this DNA is to say, okay, we know that if we've got this segment of DNA sequence, the stuff at the ends tends to be degraded, so we're just going to focus on the middle part. Well, that begs the question, how do you know the middle part isn't also degraded? And no one has really answered that question, because their DNA sequences they extract from the middle tend to fit evolution. I guess it must be working, I think is the conclusion in the mainstream community. I've independently been able to test that conclusion. These are papers I published in December of this past year, and I highlighted the links to that in the presentation I just showed. Actually, I can bring it up right now again so people can see it. I formally went through and said, okay, if this DNA is reliable, see if my computer will let me go back to that slide. Yep, here it is. It's this paper in particular where I disprove it. Mm-hmm. If this DNA is reliable, it should make certain, it was really a testable prediction. If the DNA is reliable, it should look like this. And if it's not reliable, it should look like this. I went through and formally disproved the way I did it, just to summarize very briefly. You can infer past population sizes from the Y chromosome. That's a whole technical discussion that's for another time, another place. It just so happens, if you look at the global Y chromosome family tree, and you infer past population sizes, it confirms a young Earth timescale. I realize I'm getting far afield in technical details. I'll just summarize it and say, I was able to formally disprove it in this paper. And the bottom line, the answer to Craig's argument, I would say, without going into all this complex genetic stuff that is even beyond what we discussed at the beginning of the presentation, Craig's argument assumes and treats that Neanderthal DNA is reliable, that the sequences we've obtained today are in fact representative of how the Neanderthal DNA looked when they were first buried in the ground. He's assuming, and his argument depends on saying that it's not the product of degradation over time. And you can still sequence degraded DNA to some extent, and you'll get a result. But the result is not what the DNA was originally. It's the product of what it was originally plus it degrading over time. And so I showed in that paper that it does not bear the signature of being reliable. In fact, formally disproved the possibility that either it's reliable. So there's two possibilities right now based on those data. Either it is degraded, which is, I think, the boring and most likely explanation. You don't get a lot of funding to go around saying that your results are just trash, they're rubbish. But I think that's probably the likely explanation, just what we know about DNA plus those results. Or secondly, it is reliable, but these people underwent a super fast mutation rate. And it's possible. Maybe that's why they died out, because they had some weird genetic condition and boom, 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 they just went into genetic extinction. There was so much wrong with them. Maybe that's why they looked the way they did. Who knows? I think that's less likely. But even if that's true, and their DNA clock ticks very different, much faster, all the arguments from their DNA against young Earth go away. Because to say, oh, look how different their DNA is, it doesn't fit 6,000 years. That argument assumes that everyone's clock ticks basically the same. And if it doesn't tick the same, if it ticks a whole lot faster, you can't make that argument. So his argument breaks down in that it assumes it's either reliable or that the clock ticks the same, and one or both of those assumptions is wrong. And the existence of these Neanderthal sequences is in no way an argument against the young Earth timescale, and in no way sufficient grounds for questioning the biblical anthropology and our descent from a literal Adam and Eve at the beginning.
Yeah. So it looks like Craig basically hasn't questioned some of the assumptions that have gone into Neanderthal dating.
And it's consistent from what I've been able to tell about his general approach to mainstream science. He tends to accept much of it, which it's not his field, but he's a philosopher, not a scientist. But this is the Achilles heel of what he's trying to do.
Yeah. Well, we've had a question from someone, and this may be a bit of a hypothetical question, but someone has asked, can you comment on the role of the tree of life in genetics to allow Adam and Eve to live forever? So I guess this is after Adam and Eve have sinned, and God removes them from the garden so they don't reach out to the tree of life and allow them to live forever. What would that have how would that have a role, I guess, on genetics, their genetics?
I'm glad you clarified that, because as soon as you said tree of life, my mind jumped to the evolutionary tree of life, and I was trying to think through how that question made sense in light of the evolutionary tree of life. No, it's the biblical tree of life, and now I follow the question much better, so thank you. I would say this is a question that's been discussed much internally in the US here, at least at AIG headquarters, and I think the official ministry position is one of, we don't have an official ministry position about what was it about the tree of life. How would they have been able to live forever? There's this disagreement even within AIG on what exactly that relationship is. But it's a relevant question, especially when you think about something we discussed earlier, namely the long lifespans. They lived a long time back then in Genesis 5, not so much now. So there's this pattern of we live fairly short now, lived longer back then. They would have lived forever. So connecting the dots, does the tree of life have something to do with longevity, lifespans? Is there some sort of link? And my best answer is I don't know. We don't know yet, and I don't know. There's a ministry we've resolved the biblical question yet either, but it's a very important one, and I'm sorry I don't have a better answer at this point.
Yeah. So there's still lots of questions out there that we still have to ask and still have to look into, and sometimes we may not even know the answer.
Yeah.
With these things. Briefly, if anyone else has who's watching has a question, if you want to quickly type it in, I can get that to Nathaniel. But let me ask a question that often comes up about Adam and Eve couldn't have been the first of humans because there's 98% similarity between apes and humans, and so obviously we have that common ancestry with them.
Yeah, good question. And I'll give a multi-point response briefly. I want to mention at this point, you can find a more extended response in the book Searching for Adam. Jeff Tompkins, who's a fellow geneticist at the Institute for Creation Research, he and I authored a chapter on there on Adam and Eve and genetics, where we give a much more detailed answer to that and other questions that have arisen. And you can find that chapter, in fact, for free on our website. Just look up my name and Adam and Eve or genetics, search something, relevant terms there, and you'll be able to pull it up. Master Books has kindly provided that for free because of its significance then to this question and the question of human origins and of the existence of Adam and Eve. So, first question though is, are we in fact 98% genetically identical to the chimpanzee? If you look at the primary evolutionary literature, I'm just going to answer all these questions in rapid fire without giving a ton of justification, just because there's a more detailed answer you can find online, and that we want to take another hour just to discuss that. If you look at the evolutionary literature itself, there is a good case to be made that our genetic identity is closer to 89%, 87%. You can find the details, and this is a lot of Jeff Tompkins' work, taking the raw data, realigning it, seeing what they filtered out, even looking at the chimpanzee DNA paper from 2005 itself. If you look at the supplemental, where the good stuff is, not the main text of the paper, there's indications even from their own analyses that there's chunks of human DNA that doesn't find any match in chimpanzee, chunks of chimpanzee that finds no match in humans, and you add all these together, there's a fairly significant gap. Here's the bigger question though, and I think it's an emotional one. I don't mean the question itself is emotional, but I think the evolutionists know that these high figures, high percentages, naturally, emotionally sound like we're virtually kissing cousins. Even if I say it's 87%, it's kind of close, isn't it? Two answers and responses to that. One is, let's say it is 87, 89% identical. What that means in absolute terms is there are hundreds of millions of DNA differences between us and chimpanzees. So I say, go tell your neighbor the next time they say, oh, we're 98% identical to chimpanzee. Did you know we're hundreds of millions of DNA differences? That feels emotionally much different. It feels like a big gap, and that needs to be stated, I think, because the evolutionists know what they're doing when it comes to making these sorts of arguments and the emotional impact and emotional weight that they carry. I'm going to respond in similar manner. It's hundreds of millions of DNA differences. It's a big gap. Regardless of how we want to frame it, though, emotionally, strip that away, what does it mean scientifically? It's really, in one sense, just a form of an older evolutionary argument. If we didn't have any DNA differences to account for, all we had was anatomical and physiological ones, we're still grouped anatomically and physiologically, evolutionists would say, within a great ape family. We look much more like an ape than we do like an elephant, put it that way. It's a plain fact of biology. Why? Why is that? Evolutionists say because we have a recent common ancestor. What they miss, what they ignore, is the design alternative. The Bible does not say the patterns in which God created living things in Genesis chapter 1, but we are made in God's image. And what that means in one sense is there's something about us that reflects something about God. So let's look to what humans design, the patterns in which we design things. And this may give us some inspiration and some good hypotheses into the patterns in which God may have designed things. Well, we create things in groups within groups patterns, not necessarily because we set out from the outset to do so. I'm going to make a Rolls Royce that looks more like a Honda Civic than it does like a Ford pickup truck F50, just because. No, a Rolls Royce is a certain design, or you have a sedan that's a certain design, whether it's a Honda or Mercedes or Ford or Chevrolet, they're all making sedans with a specific anatomical, so to speak, configuration, because that configuration fits the purpose. And sedans are all closer to one another than they are to pickup trucks. And these sedans and pickup trucks are closer to one another than they are to 18-wheelers, as I'd say in the United States. And these are all closer to one another physically than they are to airplanes, and then they are to boats. And there's this groups within groups patterns into which you can categorize and classify the vehicles that humans have designed. That's not because Mercedes engineers and Ford engineers sat down and said, let's make sure all our designs fit this pattern, just because we're fulfilling certain purposes, and that's how it happened. Certain functions, certain designs fit certain purposes, you reuse it. Same thing then, should be no surprise if God does at the biological level. Why wouldn't he design the human forelimb, the human digestive system, the human physiology and anatomy similar to a chimp if they're fulfilling similar biological purposes? So the fact that we're anatomically similar, physiologically similar, is perfectly explicable and matches the expectations of design. Genetics is really the blueprint behind that, so it should be no surprise that we're genetically similar, because it's the genetics that encodes the similar physiology and anatomy. So at the end of the day, the answer to why we're so similar, whatever absolute number you assign it, is because that's what design predicts. Evolution says that's what evolution predicts. So if you want to be technical about it, we both predict the same thing, and so the fact that this exists cannot be used as an argument for one side or the other. Of course, we usually hear it in the context of evolutionists trying to disprove creation. My response is, it's a far cry from that. We both explain the same thing, find a better argument. And that's some of what we discussed then in this book chapter, among other arguments that get brought up in this context: human chromosome 2 fusion, junk DNA, shared mistakes. There's all sorts of stuff. We try to be as fairly exhaustive as we could.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would encourage people, if they haven't got that book, Searching for Adam, not just because of that chapter, other great chapters in that book to help you defend the case for a literal Adam. Someone's asked the question, Nathaniel, basically thanking you for your presentation, and then asks, are you going to come up with any more debates against evolutionists? It would be interesting to see.
That's a good question. The debates I've done so far professionally, first was with Dennis Venema at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary in, I think it was spring of 2017. My book Replacing Darwin came out in the fall, and some of that material came up then. So I debated Dennis Venema. If you dig hard enough on the internet, I think you can find those videos. Southeastern was responsible for filming it and producing it and so forth. And Dennis Venema, just to summarize that debate, did what biologist people do. I'd summarize their strategy when debating on theological campuses, which is their main goal, is schmooze. They know that they have the backing of mainstream science. There's little they need to do to defend their view scientifically, because most theologians aren't sitting there staunch advocates of questioning mainstream science. They question their theological commitment. So he got up and they try to schmooze and say, look, we're genuine born-again believers too. You should have no problem with this. And that's explicit in Biologos. We exist to basically convince the church, they'd say, that evolution's true, and we're good, fellow, committed Orthodox believers. You look at what they're actually saying, and there's some really big red flags and concerns. Mm-hmm. And of course, from a young earth perspective, most theologians would not question our Orthodox commitment biblically. They perhaps view it as archaic and a little bit too tight-laced, straight-laced and rigid, and a little irritating. But they question, of course, the fact that we question mainstream science. So my goal then, of course, is to defend our scientific view, which is what I tried to do. So in a sense, I'd say we kind of talk past each other, and theistic evolutionists in general do not like to engage the scientific side, at least those I've interacted with at Biologos. That's just a granted. And man, if you question it, you're a liar. They'll say that explicitly. They'll hide it because that doesn't come across as ironic and peace promoting, but say it they do. The other debate I've done was with an evolutionary biologist from Marshall University from West Virginia, Dr. Herman Mays. This was an online debate. The Southeastern one was in person. We did it online through a skeptics show, the non sequitur show. You can find that on our website. Just type Jeanson debate in the search box on our Answers from Genesis website. You can find, I wrote a fairly long write-up summary of the debate with a video linked in there as well. I learned, or was reminded of after the fact, that Herman Mays abandoned the idea several years ago of engaging in rational debate. He wrote a blog post entitled something along the lines of "In Defense of Ridicule." In other words, he said it's long past the time that we should take creationist arguments seriously. They've been so thoroughly disproven and rejected. We should just mock them. And you can see his behavior in the debate was very consistent with that. He showed very little evidence of actually having read my book, even though the book was supposed to be the topic of the debate, and struggled to articulate any of my arguments and basically talked past it. So I found it rather unproductive. I should have been better prepared for it had I read that blog post ahead of time. And I was expecting we'd have a good, online peer review basically of what I said, and instead it was largely a waste of time. And he's talked rather large and pompous about it since then, but has not taken any steps to have another debate along those lines. And I have yet to engage anyone else or encounter anyone else who'd like to do the debate as well. In general, since the heydays several decades ago of creation evolution debates, evolutionists as a rule tend to deliberately avoid debates. Even Bill Nye, when he debated Ken Ham, received much critical feedback from his peers saying, "What are you doing giving Ken Ham a platform? You should just ignore him." And that's generally the attitude and the position taken by evolutionists when dealing with young earth creationists. I sent my book, Replacing Darwin, to prominent evolutionists, not a word from them really at all. And I understand that strategy. You don't want to use their big evolutionary platform to give young earth creation a voice. But my hope is that this message disseminates far and wide enough so that even students coming into class under these people begin to articulate these arguments, that it reaches such a level of noise, they say, okay, we can't ignore it any longer, we have to say something. So that point, to me, is when the debates happen, when they make arguments. Anyway, a short answer to that question would be, I don't have any on the docket. Given evolutionists' past behavior, I expect them to avoid debates as much as possible, but I'd be happy to do it again. Oh, there's one other debate too. I think I relinked it on my Facebook page recently. In Latin America, we still have many open doors, though they're closing quickly, on university campuses. And in September of this past year, I was at the National University in Colombia doing a debate with an evolutionist. Unfortunately, if you're not a Spanish speaker, most of it's in Spanish. I gave mine in English. Students wore headphones for simultaneous translation. So if nothing else, you can see my part in English. But I thought that was actually did very well. And the response I received from folks said that seemed to go across very well, that they really had no answers to the arguments we're articulating. And to me, it's because the Bible is true, not because somehow we're very smart. God doesn't use the smart, intelligent people of the world to shame the wise. He uses the foolish. So it's not because we somehow have captured the intellectual bandwidth of the world and are superior in that way. We're few in number, yet because the Bible is true, it doesn't take that much to find the confirmation of it in science. It's right in front of us. Romans 1, the things of God are clearly seen in nature, and to point it out is simply a good duty of the Christian and a great delight of the Christian. And the evolutionist, the atheist at the end of the day, is stuck having to concede it. Yes, it looks designed, and they're still scrambling to come up with a way to explain it apart from design, which I don't think they can.
Great. We've had two more questions come through. You okay to answer them?
Yeah.
Cool. The first one, someone asks, how do you actually count the Y chromosome ticks? Does it get more perfect the further you go back?
Yes, good question. We do not have any old sequences. So this goes back a little bit to what we discussed with William Lane Craig. Neanderthals might be the most extreme example of what I'd call ancient DNA, but there's been attempts, you can find it in the mainstream literature, of extracting DNA from people all throughout history, from the pharaohs to buried Europeans of the more recent past. They've been trying to extract DNA from dead people at multiple points in history. And to me, the answer in each of these cases is the same, unfortunately, and very boring. It looks degraded. It doesn't make predictions that suggest when you test it, it doesn't fit the idea that it's useful or that the clock ticks the same. So that's a long way of saying we don't have any sequences right now that say, this was the beginning sequence. So what do? How do you figure out what the beginning was? Well, you take my DNA, you take Simon's DNA, and you compare it. And then you compare it to African DNA, and then to Chinese DNA, and to DNA from Papua New Guinea. And it's these relative differences, because 99% of our DNA is the same, it's fairly easy to do. You can see, you take my DNA from the Y chromosome, you take Simon's DNA, match, 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 match. Oh, there's a mismatch. Match, 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 and on it goes. It's a pretty easy thing to do. You can do it electronically with computer programs rather quickly. Mm-hmm. So that's how the differences are scored. And then it's basically a mathematical optimization problem. You say, okay, given 200 Y chromosome differences between me and Simon, and then 400 differences between me or Simon and an African, and this many differences between either of us and a Chinese person, you can reconstruct a family tree of the number and of the number of branches, the branch lengths separating us based on these DNA differences. Anyway, you basically get the differences from people around the globe, again, just by lining up their sequences, which is pretty easy to do because we're all very close. Count the number of differences, and then use those mathematical numbers. You enter them into a table, whatever you want to do. There's computer programs for all of this. And you use those mathematical differences to try to reconstruct a family tree. And then it becomes fairly easy to say, okay, that looks like the middle spot. And you can kind of walk your way backwards to say, here's where we minimize all the differences among all people. So unfortunately, we do not have a way to say, that's obviously a mutation, that's obviously created. They just look like letters. There's nothing special about them that says mutation. It's just, is there a difference or not? And given the absolute number of differences among various people groups and individuals, you can use those differences to mathematically reconstruct a family tree, and then find the point on the tree that either looks like the beginning, or what I've done in some of the papers I've published, empirically, scientifically test which spot best fits the beginning, which is what I've done in those papers that I showed earlier and published in December.
Right. The final question we'll get to is this. Someone asks, are evolutionists making any predictions about the supposed future evolution of mankind? And if so, over what supposed timeline?
A very good question that gets to the heart of the debate today. Two things come to mind. First is, there is talk and chatter in the evolutionary literature of how fast our DNA is degrading. And is our species going towards genetic extinction? And that's a real concern. I'd say from an evolutionary perspective, but even from a creationist perspective, the difference though being, number one, they have no hope. They have no answer for it. There really is no way scientifically to reverse it. And then once we go extinct, they're just natural selection. That's the way the natural processes, fate, chance, that's just the way the world, it's the way it goes. There's no theological comfort in the evolutionary view. Whereas the Christian has a great eschatology, a hope of the glorious future to look forward to. Death is the passageway by which we come face to face with God himself, those who trust in Christ, those who do not have an awful future to look forward to, which is why all must repent before it's too late. But in both cases, it looks like, I think creationists and evolutionists would agree, it does look like things are getting worse, which, no surprise, from a biblical perspective, the world is sinful, it's been cursed by God, it's headed towards destruction, and all will be destroyed, and someday there'll be a new heavens and a new earth, which Christians can look forward to. The second thing that comes to mind, so first is what predictions they make. They see the trajectory of it's getting worse. But here's really what matters from a scientific perspective. Evolutionists have defined and excluded creationism from the discussion by saying we don't make testable predictions. We don't put things in print that say, here's how the future is going to look, and then wait for future things to happen to see if it's true or false. So the simple example I like to think of is, I've got a water bottle here. If I drop it, gravity predicts that it's going to fall. Right now, me letting go of the water bottle is future. I predict it'll fall. Gravity predicts it'll fall. Now I let go. The future becomes the present. It's true. It's a testable prediction. That's the type of thing they're looking for in genetics. Well, I've done that now. Creationists have been doing this in other fields of science as well. I've put predictions in print. Here's how fast or slow the African rate of Y chromosome change or mitochondrial DNA change should occur. And I mention that specifically because no one's yet measured that rate in African peoples. It's only been in non-African peoples. These are the type of predictions that evolutionists should put in print. I've made predictions about the function of specific DNA positions, whether or not they should contribute to disease or whether they're part of the original design. Evolutionists should be able to make such predictions themselves. Here's what's most telling, I think. There's been a anonymous evolutionary biology graduate student who's been trying to take my book chapter by chapter and criticize it. And really the fulcrum of the book is chapter 7, where I talk about mitochondrial DNA clocks. And say, here's where the data looks right now, and I challenge evolutionists to make predictions. I make predictions. Well, he's got a very long-winded criticism written up on the web of that chapter. What's notably absent in his criticism is any testable predictions of his own. Now, the Y chromosome data I'm discussing are, in fact, a fulfilled prediction of stuff I put in print in Replacing Darwin. I don't discuss Y chromosome data in Replacing Darwin because we didn't have the answers then. I made predictions in Replacing Darwin, and lo and behold, we're a couple years later, and they've come true. Here's what evolutionists need to do if they want to meet their own standard for science. They say creationists are not scientists because they're not doing this sort of thing. Now we are. I don't see any evidence from the evolutionists that they are. This is the pickle in which they would now find themselves. They've essentially backed themselves into a corner. Legally in the United States, they've insisted this is the standard for science. Now creationists have met and exceeded it. What are the evolutionists going to do in response? They're behind the 8 ball. They're not only do they not have that long-standing objection to creation, they can't say that anymore. Well, you're not science because you don't do X, Y, and Z. No, we do X, Y, and Z now. What can you say in response? That objection goes away. Now, on the flip side, now they're in a defensive position, having to meet their own standard, and I've yet to see good evidence for it. So this is a brand new era in the creation evolution debate, very different from the creation evolution debate of 40 years ago, which 1982 in the United States was a significant court decision. So this is an exciting time to be a creationist. I would say the vast majority of the mainstream community has no idea how this debate has shifted, and so they're in for a really big surprise. And once this information goes far and wide, they're going to have a lot of work to do to come up with a rational response to it, because we've taken what they've said to heart, responded to it, met the standard, exceeded it, and now we're waiting for them to do the same.
Great. Some really good answers there tonight, Nathaniel. Thank you very much. And if you haven't got a copy of Replacing Darwin or the booklet version, Replacing Darwin Made Simple, then go to answersingenesis.org, go to the store. At least in the UK, we're still offering 20% off all our resources, and get this material out to your friends, your family members, into your churches, so people know what's going on and how they can best help their friends understand these things. So, because the most important thing is, we touched on at the beginning, as Nathaniel touched on, is that people trust Christ, because the future is bleak from an evolutionary point of view, but the future is glorious if you're a Christian, because we know the future of the new heavens and a new earth because of what Christ has done on the cross. So Nathaniel, thank you for your time this evening. I know people have been